Karl Marx. Part 3. Exploitation again. Why does Marx think the buyer-seller nexus in the context of labour is necessarily exploitative? In brief and crudely, as we've seen, it is a matter of theft. The employer pays for X and obtains X plus delta. The price of labour is less than the price of the finished good produced by that labour. By the same token, the price of all factors entering into the finished good, material, rent, licensing fees, insurance, and so on, are less than the price of the finished good, assuming as always that the business is a going concern and turning a profit. If not, the price of the finished good may actually be less than its factor prices. Anyway, in an 1865 work, Value, Price and Profit, Marx gives us a short account of his theory. He writes, "Now suppose that the average amount of the daily necessaries of a labouring man requires 6 hours of average labour for their production. Suppose, moreover, 6 hours of average labour to be also realised in a quantity of gold equal to 3 shillings. Then 3 shillings would be the price, or the monetary expression, of the daily value of that man's labouring power. If he worked daily 6 hours, he would daily produce a value sufficient to buy the average amount of his daily necessaries, or to maintain himself as a labouring man. But our man is a wages labourer. He must therefore sell his labouring power to a capitalist. If he sells it at 3 shillings daily or 18 shillings weekly, he sells it at its value. Suppose him to be a spinner. If he works 6 hours daily, he will add to the cotton a value of 3 shillings daily. This value, daily added by him, would be an exact equivalent for the wages or the price of his labouring power received daily. But in that case, no surplus value or surplus produce whatever would go to the capitalist. Here then, we come to the rub. In buying the labouring power of the workman and paying its value, the capitalist, like every other purchaser, has acquired the right to consume or use the commodity bought. You consume or use the labouring power of a man by making him work as you consume or use a machine by making it run. By buying the daily or weekly value of the labouring power of the workman, the capitalist has therefore acquired the right to use or make that labouring power during the whole day or week. The working day or the working week has, of course, certain limits, but those we shall afterwards look more closely at. For the present, I want to turn your attention to one decisive point, writes Marx. The value of the labouring power is determined by the quantity of labour necessary to maintain or reproduce it, but the use of that labouring power is only limited by the active energies and physical strength of the labourer. The daily or weekly value of the labouring power is quite distinct from the daily or weekly exercise of that power. The same as the food a horse wants and the time it can carry the horseman are quite distinct. The quantity of labour by which the value of the workman's labouring power is limited forms by no means a limit to the quantity of labour which his labouring power is apt to perform. Take the example of a spinner. We have seen that to daily reproduce his labouring power he must daily reproduce a value of 3 shillings, which he will do by working 6 hours daily. But this does not disable him from working 10 or 12 or more hours a day. But by paying the daily or weekly value of the spinner's labouring power, the capitalist has acquired the right of using that labouring power during the whole day or week. He will therefore make him work, say daily, 12 hours. Over and above the 6 hours required to replace his wages or the value of his labouring power, he will therefore have to work 6 other hours, which I shall call hours of surplus labour, which surplus labour will realise itself in the surplus value and the surplus produce. If our spinner, for example, by his daily labour of 6 hours, added 3 shillings value to the cotton, a value forming an exact equivalent to his wages, he will, in 12 hours, add 6 shillings worth to the cotton and produce a proportional surplus of yarn. As he has sold his labouring power to the capitalist, the whole value of produce created by him belongs to the capitalist, the owner pro tempore of his labouring power. By advancing 3 shillings, the capitalist will therefore realise a value of 6 shillings, because advancing a value in which 6 hours of labour are crystallised, he will receive in return a value in which 12 hours of labour are crystallised. By repeating this same process daily, The capitalist will daily advance 3 shillings and daily pocket 6 shillings, one half of which will go to pay wages anew, and the other half of which will form surplus value, for which the capitalist pays no equivalent. It is this sort of exchange between capital and labour upon which capitalistic production, or the wages system, is founded, and which must constantly result in reproducing the working man as a working man, and the capitalist as a capitalist. Marx continues. The rate of surplus value, all other circumstances remaining the same, will depend on the proportion between that part of the working day necessary to reproduce the value of the labouring power and the surplus time or surplus labour performed for the capitalist. It will therefore depend on the ratio in which the working day is prolonged over and above that extent, by working which the working man would only reproduce the value of his labouring power, or replace his wages. So the worker works for X hours to pay the cost of his maintenance, but the employer makes him work for X plus delta and keeps the delta for himself. The employer pays for labour but gets labour power. Exploitation, then, is a form of theft. One might wonder why, in the absence of coercion, any worker would agree to such a bad bargain. If a gun is put to your head, then yes, you will agree to do things that otherwise you would decline to do. But where is the gun in ordinary employment? In Capital, Marx makes extensive use of a network of interrelated concepts: use value, exchange value, surplus value, labour, labour power, and of course, capital. The cornerstone of this conceptual complex is the notion of the labour theory of value. Crudely put, this amounts to the claim that the value of a commodity is a function of the amount of labour that went into its creation. Marx's account eventually involved a slightly more sophisticated version of this thesis, with brute labour being replaced by the idea of socially useful labour, but the basic idea remains. The value of a commodity is determined by the amount of qualified labour that went into its production. Marx has a remarkably crude understanding of what production consists in: the immediate activity of the labourers. Despite the title of his major work, Capital, he seems to have had no real conception of the function of capital in the production process, still less any conception of the role of the entrepreneur or even the manager. It is as if he thought that a film director contributed nothing to a film because he didn't appear on screen, or that a conductor made no contribution to the performance of any orchestra. Together with the massive underappreciation of the capitalist goes a massive overappreciation of the manual labourer. Now, there are a number of things to note about this labour theory of value. First, it was a commonplace of the standard economics of the period in which Marx was writing. He didn't invent the concept, he merely took it over from existing economic theory. The whole of Capital can be seen as an exhibition of the problems that follow if this notion is taken seriously. To that extent, Capital is largely consistent. However, the labour theory of value is economically obsolete, and it was replaced even during Marx's lifetime by the concept of marginal utility. Modern economic thought has long abandoned the view that commodities exchange according to the working time stored up in them. Price is in fact determined by supply and demand, by the amount of capital invested, the scarcity of the raw material involved, and many other factors, writes Bull. The concept of marginal utility is standardly taken to have had 3 fathers. William Stanley Jevons, who first articulated the idea in a paper published in 1863, and included it in his The Theory of Political Economy in 1871, which made his name as the leading economist of the period. Karl Menger came up with the idea in his Principles of Economics in 1871, and Leon Walras in his Éléments d'économie politique pure in 1874. The first volume of Capital was published in 1867, some years after the first appearance of Jevons' paper, but before its widespread dissemination. However, Marx didn't die until 1883, and it is hardly conceivable that he could have been unaware of the new economics. As David Gordon notes, although the marginalist or subjective revolution in economics began in the 1870s, a decade of great intellectual activity for Marx, he failed to note its occurrence. Karl Menger writes, "There is no necessary and direct connection between the value of a good and whether or in what quantities labour and other goods of higher order were applied to its production. A non-economic good, say a quantity of timber in a virgin forest for example, does not attain value for men if large quantities of labour or other economic goods were applied to its production. Whether a diamond was found accidentally or was obtained from a diamond pit with the employment of 1,000 days of labour is completely irrelevant for its value. In general, no one in practical life asks for the history of the origin of a good in estimating its value, but considers solely the services that the good will render him and which he would have to forgo if he didn't have it at his command. Goods on which much labour has been expended often have no value, while others on which little or no labour was expended have a very high value. Goods on which much labour was expended and others on which little or no labour was expended are often of equal value to economizing men. The quantities of labour or of other means of production applied to its production cannot therefore be the determining factor in the value of a good. Comparison of the value of a good with the value of the means of production employed in its production does of course show whether and to what extent its production, an act of past human activities, was appropriate or economic. But the quantities of goods employed in the production of a good have neither a necessary nor a directly determining influence on its value." So writes Menger. Summing up, David Gordon writes, "Instead of asking, as the classical economists did, what objective property of goods makes them valuable, these writers placed value in the minds of consumers. Values arise from the subjective preferences, not from the cost of production. Included in the cost theories spurned by this group is the labour theory. I realise that this subject is controversial and that many increasingly sophisticated and complicated accounts have been provided in an effort to save the Marxist theory without the indefensible labour theory of value, but all such efforts are productions of Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark. Some have attempted to salvage what they regard as the ship of Marxism, while jettisoning its redundant cargo. We have seen that there are fundamental problems with the conceptual structure of Marx's attack on capitalism. A labour theory of value is not defensible, and to the extent that the remainder of Marx's ideas, for example, the key notion of exploitation, rests on the indefensible theory, Marx cannot sustain it. Of course, it must be stated that the fact that Marx's explanation of exploitation in Capital is rendered nugatory by his failure to come to terms with the marginal theory of utility doesn't mean that there isn't exploitation, and that if there were such exploitation it wouldn't be reprehensible. It does mean, however, that Marx hasn't established it by the means he has chosen. Over the years, efforts have been made to make and mend Marxism without much success. But in the mid-20th century, a loose school of revisionist Marxism developed, sometimes called analytical Marxism, that attempted to purge Marx's theories of their unacceptable elements and reconstruct what they regard as its central insights on firmer foundations. I can't devote a lot of space to this neo-Marxism here, save to say that the more it is defensible, the less it looks anything like Marxism. By and large, the adherents of the school accept that the labour theory of value is dead in the water. John Elster comments trenchantly, "The labour theory is useless at best, harmful and misleading at its not infrequent worst." If exploitation cannot be explained by the labour theory of value, how then is it to be conceived? Where there is no manifest coercion or violence, how can it be that workers are exploited by capitalists? Our analytical Marxists propose different answers to this question. G. A. Cohn accepts that individual workers may be free to enter or leave capitalist employment, but argues that they are collectively unfree to do so. John Rumer locates the root of exploitation in the differential ownership of capital assets. Assessing the efforts of these Marxist revisionists, David Gordon concludes that very little remains of Marxism when Elster and his colleagues are finished analysing and defending it. When all the criticisms are put together, Analytical Marxism becomes a formidable weapon in the hands of anti-Marxists. As an instrument for a Marxist renaissance, it fails. So, whatever about its internal consistency, the whole enterprise that Marx is attempting in Capital is fundamentally wrong-headed. The value of a commodity X is nothing objective and is not to be found in the commodity. Value is not a property that X can possess in and of itself. It is a relational property. Value is what a desk is worth to John Grisham, as John Grisham considers it. Moreover, labour is not a thing. It cannot be congealed, packaged, put into something, or reside somewhere. Labour is an activity of a human being, and it exists only when that human being is labouring. We can point the finger to a certain extent at the Lockean metaphor of mixing one's labour from the second treatise. The more important concept in Locke is not mixing one's labour with some external object, but that of improvement. The labour mixing image, and that is all it is, an image, is a way of capturing the intuition that when I form something by, say, carving it from a piece of wood or moulding a piece of clay, I thereby establish a preemptive claim to own it. So a desk is worth nothing in and of itself. Whatever value it has only in relation to those who are willing to exchange. As was a commonplace among those who considered such matters, Marx believed that an uncoerced exchange involved an equality. If A is to be exchanged for B, and A and B are not the same, there must be something that is identical to both, which makes them equal to each other. And for Marx, that is labour. Of course, exchange is not an equality. If it were, it wouldn't, under normal circumstances, take place. It is rather a mutual inequality. It's relatively easy to establish this point. Suppose your hobby is constructing replicas of famous buildings from lollipop sticks. You spend 20 years working on a replica of the Taj Mahal. At 40 hours per week, by 50 weeks per year, you take 2 weeks holiday. By 20 years, this comes to 40,000 hours. Let's take $5 as the going rate for labour. By my reckoning, your model is worth $200,000. Or perhaps it is. Try selling it. My guess is that you'll be sadly disappointed. The likelihood of finding someone who will pay that amount for your replica is close to vanishing point. The element of truth in the labour theory of value is that if the cost of manufacturing X, the cost to be determined by the price of material, labour, transport, overheads, and so on, if that's greater than the price I can obtain for it in the market, I won't stay in business for very long. Now, in case it should be forgotten, the point of the whole labour theory apparatus is to explain the notion of exploitation, and it is this notion that really concerns Marx. David Gordon summarizes the Marxist exploitation account as follows. He writes, "Capitalism inevitably creates two classes: capitalists, owners of the means of production, and workers. The former, having brought it about that the latter have no choice but to work for them, extract profits through the exploitation of the worker. It's no use talking of free economic activity in the context of a system in which the wealth held by the members of each of the two main classes varies so greatly. Freedom in such an arrangement is a sham. To talk of the justice of capitalism is to stand on empty verbiage." That's David Gordon's account. If, as seems to be the case, Marx's theory of exploitation rests on the labour theory of value, and if that theory turns out to be false, then Marx has not explained where the exploitation of workers comes from. However, it doesn't follow that there isn't exploitation of the workers by capitalists. There might be an account that doesn't suffer from the problems of the labour theory of value, so that it might still be true that workers sell their labour power and receive in return enough to sustain their labour, and that the difference in value between what they produce and what they receive as wages is the source of rent, interest and profit, even if it is not the case that the values of goods, including labour, are determined by the socially necessary labour time required to produce them. Is the term exploitation a purely economic descriptive notion, or does it contain a normative element, a negative normative element? If the latter, what is the basis for the normative judgment? Even if it is true that the value that a worker receives is less than the value he creates for his employer, Why is that necessarily exploitation? Some passages in Marx clearly suggest a moralized conception of exploitation. Take the following. He writes, "Labour power is not purchased under the system for the purpose of satisfying the personal needs of the buyer, either by its service or through its product. The aim of the buyer is the valorization of his capital, the production of commodities which contain more labour than he paid for, and therefore contain a portion of value which costs him nothing and is nevertheless realized through the sale of those commodities." Taking something that one did not pay for, which belongs to something else, sounds suspiciously like theft. The exchange value of X is determined by the amount of socially necessary labour required to produce X. The capitalist exploits the worker by purchasing his labour power and forcing him to work extra time beyond the time necessary to produce X. Surplus value then derives from unpaid working time. Where the few control all the capital, it is inevitable that the workers will be exploited. Given the labour theory of value, class conflict is unavoidable, and the only solution is the removal of capital from the hands of the few by means of the collectivization of the means of production. It might be urged that if the employer pays the worker less than the full value of his contribution, the worker is disadvantaged. Again, if this amounts to the claim that such a procedure is unjust, we've simply begged the question. What then could a non-question begging account of disadvantage mean? Perhaps it is that workers are forced to work for their employers. If this were so, then workers would be at a disadvantage, so the question now becomes, are workers actually forced to work for employers? On the face of it, this doesn't seem to be the case. They are free to work for themselves, or to form cooperatives and work for one another. Where is the coercion? Is the claim that a worker is entitled to all the value that it creates? Well, this might be true, but it's not obviously true. Perhaps, after all, on a more adequate economic analysis, when all of the factors of production are taken into account, the worker does receive the full value of his labour, so there is no exploitative gap to be explained.